If you think about the ownership of different industrial or economic sectors, there are two very extreme positions on opposite sides of things. So on the one hand, we could advocate for everything to be privately owned, which is some form of free market capitalism, or we could advocate for everything to be state-owned, which would be some form of communism. And the thing is that both of these options, as advocated as extremes, are both very, very radical. They're both extreme and dangerous positions to hold. We might want to have a more nuanced position where some sectors are privately owned and some are publicly owned and some are a mix and some are collectively owned by the workers. This is what's meant by a mixed economy and what we're talking about today. In sectors like, let's say, road transportation or water infrastructure, we probably wouldn't want competing road networks or competing water systems, and we probably don't want to have private monopolies in these sectors. No matter how well regulated private monopoly sectors are, or no matter how well we regulate a natural monopoly if it's privately owned, there's going to be problems. It's a very inefficient way of doing things. First of all, because the incentive of the person or private enterprise owning the monopoly is to raise prices, because there is no competition. And this means that the government has to step in and regulate, but that's very wasteful because the infrastructure that's necessary in terms of all the regulatory agencies, it means a lot of resources are being expended to keep that free market capitalism in check in a monopoly industry. The argument that free market enterprise is always more efficient is not true. Some sectors, especially sectors that are prone to being natural monopolies, are very inefficient to have privately owned. The private enterprise makes them more expensive, so in terms of efficiency for people buying or using the services or infrastructure, it's very expensive for them relative to being publicly owned. And because it's a natural monopoly, enormous amounts of public resources still have to be expended to regulate the industry to make sure the monopoly doesn't get so out of control that price gouging is just so bad. Private ownership in these kinds of sectors harms the public interest because it's less efficient, it's generally less safe because the private sector doesn't invest in the level of safety that's required sometimes. It's obviously going to be more expensive as well for people buying in the service or using the infrastructure. On the other hand, there are some sectors of the economy that do lend themselves very well to being privately owned. These are sectors that are highly competitive, that are easy to enter, that they aren't really necessary for physical survival, things like that. And this is because in those sectors, having private ownership tends to increase choice and the number of options available to people wanting to buy something from that sector or from that industry. It doesn't really make sense also for the state to own companies that are, for example, producing luxury jewelry or pet rocks or any number of many industries and sectors and products and services. There's a lot of things that we can imagine that the state should probably have no say in doing. We should not expect the same type of ownership to be equally appropriate for every sector of the economy. A considered approach would be better for determining the best ownership structure for each economic sector. This will produce better outcomes for everyone and allow the combination of providing equitable services with providing more choice for people in each of those respective sectors. The problem is that we need guidelines to help us decide which type of ownership structure is best for each sector of the economy. To provide a bit of a general framework of what we're dealing with here, there are three types of ownership. First, there is private ownership, which is when individuals own enterprises, and they do so for their own benefit, and they hire workers to do the work. The second kind of ownership is what we might call cooperative ownership. That's when workers own the enterprises for the benefit of themselves, and that usually new workers will become owners, sometimes after a amount of time, but usually new workers will become owners themselves. The third general type is public ownership, and this is when the state or the government or the public in general own the enterprise for the benefit of everyone, and people are hired as workers. There are, of course, other types of ownership and hybrid models of these and different subtypes of these types of ownerships, but for the general purpose of understanding what we're talking about here, we need to understand those three broad general types. Those are the three broad types that will help us to explain some overall principles. What one believes about whether things should be privately owned or publicly owned tend to depend on your position in society. Of course, ideology plays a big role, but generally speaking, ideology arises out of your material conditions. And so the material conditions of someone's life will often motivate their ideology. And of course, material conditions has a lot to do with your upbringing and your parents and the conditions you're raised in, which obviously kind of proves the point. For example, poor people do not have as much disposable income, and most of their income goes towards paying for basic needs like housing, water, and electricity. When these sectors are privatized, then their retail prices, which is what people must pay, increases because the companies that are producing and managing these sectors must also extract profits in addition to outlaying costs to provide these services. This privatization affects the poor disproportionately more than the wealthy, because the poor cannot absorb the additional costs of providing all this profit as easily as the wealthy can. So the wealthy have more disposable income. They can afford to pay a bit more for water, housing, and electricity. And it doesn't hurt their bottom line as much because they have more disposable income also, and their quality of life can be maintained despite higher costs from profit seeking in these sectors. The greater costs are a smaller proportion of wealthy household budgets than for poorer household budgets, so the wealthy are not as concerned when these sectors become privatized. In addition, the privatization of many sectors actually ends up benefiting the wealthy relative to the poor for a number of reasons. For example, when healthcare and education is privatized, the wealthy can receive priority medical care by paying a bit more for that service, or they can send their children to more elite schools with better resources, better facilities. When healthcare and education is publicly owned, it becomes more equitable, and it makes it cheaper for poor to access higher quality services because the costs are shared across everyone in society. There's another way that the wealthy will benefit from the privatization of various sectors. For example, the wealthy will use some of their disposable income to buy up privatized infrastructure and public assets as investments. They can then collect the excess profits from these newly privatized industries as part of their investment portfolio. So this means they'll earn income, but they are not adding any new value, they're not actually creating any true wealth, and they're not contributing to the real economy. They're basically extracting wealth without working from the poorer working citizens who are using that infrastructure and are working to maintain the infrastructure, while of course the wealthy still use the infrastructure, but they are not working to contribute to it. They're just extracting dividends and basically what we call rents. They're extracting rents because they now own the privatized infrastructure. So everyone's using the same infrastructure, but now one class of people owns the infrastructure and collects rents. And this is how we get a very inequitable society that gets worse and worse. It spirals out of control. It's very easy to see why wealthy people would favor private ownership, while poorer people would favor public ownership. Ideology is influenced by your material conditions. Everyone lives in their own little social bubbles with other people like them. Ideological beliefs reinforce themselves because when you live near people who all have the same material conditions, you view the world in the same way, and you reinforce each other's beliefs within your social circles. But if we want to make a better society, we have to think outside of our lived experiences, outside of our little bubbles. We have to be able to think of the lives lived by everyone so that we can think of a way that everyone can benefit. We can make a better society for everyone. Because a society that only serves one group or class of people is not a stable society and will eventually collapse. It is just a matter of time. There's a number of other issues here. Wealthy people generally have enough disposable income to spend on discretionary goods and luxuries, things like jewelry, art, and hospitality services like restaurants and hotels. When these sectors are publicly owned, the number of choices and options will decrease because it's in the public interest just to sort of provide the basics of any of these sectors. So publicly owned firms will try to provide enough for everyone. When these sectors are publicly owned, the number of choices and options will decrease because publicly owned firms try to provide enough for everyone. Within these sectors, this affects wealthy people more because they're the ones who have the disposable income to spend within these sectors. they have money to spend on discretionary goods and luxury items. When these sectors are publicly owned and they're not providing much choice, wealthy people think it's a terrible thing because they have to buy the same jewelry. There aren't as many choices. So this is obviously, those sectors probably should be privately owned. The decreased choice and options do not affect poor people as much because they don't really have the disposable income in the first place to buy these expensive discretionary goods. So they are not as concerned when these sectors might become publicly owned. In fact, it might help them because where they couldn't afford any luxury goods, if they're publicly produced, the cost might come down, and now they would be able to. Private ownership of these sectors helps wealthy people because it expands the choices and options available to them to spend their discretionary income, whereas privatization of these sectors has little effect on poor people because they don't have the discretionary income to purchase these luxury items and non-necessary goods and services. But it also introduces inequities for the services that everyone uses, like water infrastructure and healthcare and education and road systems. Another reason for diverging beliefs regarding public versus private ownership is that it depends on which sector of the economy we are talking about. For sectors that form natural monopolies and provide something that everyone needs, for example, for their physical survival, private ownership produces exploitative and harmful outcomes. For sectors that can be highly competitive and provide discretionary goods and luxury items for people, public ownership will reduce freedom of choice. We can make very invalid arguments for private versus public ownership by focusing on limited sectors of the economy because different arguments are more believable when they're applied to different sectors. And we can't sort of make an argument for a luxury goods sector that also apply to a physical necessities sector. So we can make very convincing arguments for different kinds of ownership structures for the overall economy by focusing on specific sectors while ignoring the consequences of that argument in other sectors of the economy. For example, we could point to water infrastructure and make a very good argument that public ownership is the best thing to do for the economy. Or we could point to jewelry production and make a very good argument that private ownership is the best for the economy. But the most appropriate type of ownership for a sector will depend on the nature of that sector and the types of goods and services that it provides. We need some principles to decide why one sector should be privately owned and another should be publicly owned. And that's what we'll explore in this series.